Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the letterer of every comic you love. It's Aditya Bidikar. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, man. How's it going?
Well, it's, let's see, it's 8:49 here, which means that it is 11:19 where you are.
Yep. Yeah, actually, it was quite busy. I delivered 3 books, I think, today, and then obviously I got the timing for our podcast wrong, so there was that. But yeah, like I think, yeah, it was a busy day. Mostly short stories, so that's perfectly fine. Like I had one meeting with Ram about like one of our books, so that was fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How was your day? Actually, wait, you're just starting your day.
Very early. I'm like halfway through a coffee, which honestly, like, that's the best part of starting this podcast a little later than I expected. I actually have caffeine in me as opposed to you're dealing with a sad sack of human gunk, because that's what we would normally deal with.
I have green tea here.
Oh,
like, so I'm trying to calm down while you're trying to wake up.
You were just dealing with a rush of deadlines. You had a lot that was coming up. Did you make it through okay?
Yeah. All good. I'm done for the day.
I'm very interested in how you schedule your days, because you said you had a meeting with Ram.
Yeah.
I'm always interested in processes for people, and having never, besides Hassan Otsman El-How, your pal / fellow podcaster, I've never had a letter on to like explicitly talk about it. And I think it's really interesting because in my head, a lot of your work would be kind of oriented around what's due next. Like, is that kind of the primary driver, or do you try to work in time for figuring out kind of big answers for projects, what's next, things like that?
So till around last year, I used to kind of it was just firefighting all the way through. So like whatever projects now, like that's what I'm doing. But I took on slightly too many books during the pandemic, and because I'm a workaholic, I kind of spent my entire time doing that. And so I messed up my health quite badly. So I had like a hip problem. I had some I've developed diabetes, and like I have heart rate issues. Nothing major, but like not good for like the age of 36. So after that, I realized that, okay, you know what? I cannot be in firefighting mode all the time. I cannot let other people's requirements kind of direct my schedule so completely. So another letterer, Jim Campbell, actually sent me this spreadsheet, which is kind of, so I used to have like a week's overview. Like I used to kind of know what books I'm doing this week. But let's say one of my clients just suddenly sent me a book and says, they need it on Monday. I kind of had to deliver it. So instead of that, what I started doing with Jim's spreadsheet was like, okay, it's month to month, right? Like, so every month I know how many pages I'm doing, and like when they have to kind of go. So I used a kind of calendar to kind of schedule. So I have a calendar where let's say 3 days for one book and then 2 days for the next book. And the moment I started using that, I realized that I was doing way too much work.
Yeah.
Like I had essentially at least one book per weekday. And I don't work Saturday and Sunday. Like that's been my rule for like the last 5 years. So I was just kind of like, I was just working myself to the bone. So after that, I realized, okay, you know what? I cannot take on this much. So I backed out of a few projects. Everybody was very understanding. And the remaining books, I just kind of like, I started very strictly scheduling stuff. So like, okay, if this is coming in on Monday, then Monday I'm working on this. So I now email my clients around like every week if I don't know when their book is coming in, and I check. So like, now at this point, I'm at the point where nothing surprises me. Like there are no surprises. Like I know if this is coming in on Tuesday, then I can move something else to next week. I've got like this calendar thing, and I've got like, okay, I cannot go beyond like, let's say, when I kind of started doing the calendar, I was doing something like 500 pages per month, which is way too much. Yeah, I realized that I was doing that. So immediately I brought it down to like 400, which is barely manageable. Right now I'm at around 200. So like, there's like a week off built in like every month, and and that week kind of gives me a buffer, so like I can move stuff to emergencies and things like that. So yeah, like I used to completely like just let people direct my schedule, which I was very frustrated by. Like I used to complain about it all the time. And then I realized that, okay, like if I just change my working methods a little bit and I take on some sort of editorial scheduling kind of duties from the editor, I can actually like take care of all of this stuff. Yeah.
So was that the first time? Because I imagine when you're in it, when you're in the flow and you're just doing the work, especially when you're on the fire drill, you just kind of are doing everything you can to survive. You probably didn't have any you were aware that you were doing a lot, but you didn't have any real contextualization for what that meant. When you put that all into the document, was that the first time you're like, oh my God, based off of my math, basically the equivalent of 25 single issues a month.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I don't think I'd realized that till now, because I would also always think of this as, okay, I have these many books this week, but I can take something on next week. And what I didn't realize was that I was just completely overscheduling myself.
Well, and one thing I've kind of come across a lot is, especially, I don't really even know where to say you are in your career, because it kind of seems to me that one day you weren't there and then the next day you were everywhere. I'm sure it doesn't feel like that. But the thing is like, I know when people are kind of earlier in their career, they really want to take all the projects they can get because they don't know when the next one's going to come. Maybe you're not going to get this opportunity to do X comic or Y comic, so you have to say yes today. Was that kind of the path that took you to that overload?
I would say so. So basically, I started freelancing around 5 years ago. But before that, I was working for an Indian company for 3 years as a letterer. So it's not like, I know it feels to like American readers that I kind of came from nowhere, but I was working for 3 years. And before that, I was freelancing for like a year and a half and stuff. So when I started freelancing, that was absolutely the case. Like, I had a lot of time, and I am by nature a fairly anxious person. So I was constantly worrying about, where my next work was coming from. So I wouldn't say no to anything. Like I mean, obviously there's stuff that I won't letter, like stuff that I kind of hate speech and stuff like that. But other than that, like I would just take on everything. And then what I realized was that I had the choice. Like I could kind of take on just like, the good stuff, let's say, like just the bits that I'm like, oh, I would read this. The problem at 2020 was that
You wanted to read
everything that was
everything?
offered to me, exactly. Like, I mean, at this point, like the people that I wanted to work with for like 8 years are now working with me, and I'm supposed to say no to that. Like, how does that happen?
Sorry, Sloan Leong. You're not good enough to work with me. I'm too busy. Just kidding. I'm working with you because A Map to the Sun is awesome.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, yep, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it would be tough. I mean, like looking through your list, it's like, who do you say no to? You're going to say no to Rom? God, that'd be. I'm trying to imagine his reaction to that. Like, what?
No, exactly. Like, finally, when I did say that, he was actually like, I mean, everybody was really understanding about it. Like, everybody was like, you know what, you cannot mess up your health. You need to take your time. So, like, you know what, we are here. We'll keep working with you. Like, don't worry about it. Just take time off. Just take care of yourself, and then come back. So that was pretty good.
Was the hip stuff basically related to having to sit all day?
Yep. Because the lockdown here was fairly strict. I mean, literally. So I stay on the highway, and literally outside my gate is a police van, and almost at all times, because it's like a bit of a, it's an outskirts area. And when the strict lockdown was on, there were a lot of people breaking lockdown in India. So then there was a time when literally you weren't allowed to leave your building. Like you can't even go for a walk.
Wow.
Right. So that was like almost 4 months when I was doing nothing but working and like cooking and eating, like, food and stuff, and then sit down and work, because I couldn't meet anybody. And just like, yeah. And the thing is, I love my work. So it didn't seem like a problem at first.
Yeah.
And then apparently I kind of messed up my body to the point where like I had a hip issue. Like one of my hip tendons was kind of extremely weakened, and also like my lower back. So I have a new chair now, like that kind of takes care of that. But yeah, like I genuinely like, weirdly enough, I didn't have any carpal tunnel stuff. Like I didn't have any wrist issues because that's something that I tried to take care of like years ago in my 20s. So I didn't have any of that, but like this is just unexpected stuff. So even now I have to move every hour or so. Otherwise, like, 2 days from now, I'll start having an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still a bit delicate.
I think that's like one of the things that people don't really realize about comic creators. Like there's a lot of artists who have health problems because of having to sit all day. I mean, I know that since then standing desks have helped a lot and people trying to be more health conscious and things like that. But there's a physical toll to sitting all the time. There's like a million studies. You can just Google it and you can see like a million studies about like how sitting all day is not so good for you. And that's kind of a requirement for somebody in your line of work. I'm glad. I mean, I was going to comment. You do seem like you have a very fancy, perhaps gaming chair behind you. So like,
Yeah, it's a gaming.
you're giving me like aspirations. My chair is like a Office Max thing that I got right at the beginning of the pandemic. I need a gaming chair. What am I doing?
Yeah, like and the thing is, you spend so much time in this. Like, I mean, even now I spend around 5 to 6 hours a day at least in this chair.
Hmm.
So it should be good. Like, this is something that, and I don't think you realize it in your 20s. Like in your 20s, you recover very quickly. But what you then start to realize is that those injuries actually stay with you for longer and longer. So old injuries start kind of coming back. I mean, I haven't experienced this, but I know friends in their like 40s and 50s who tell me like, injuries from their 20s are kind of coming back. So, you just got to try and minimize that early on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Nate Picos also had like some back issues, I think, because of like working long hours. And he's been warning all the freelance letterers like for a really long time. Like, guys, just don't take on so much work that it messes up your health, you know?
I always like Steve Lieber. He always tweets like just reminding people randomly to sit up straight. And I'm like, whatever, Steve, you're not the boss of me. Let's go back to the beginning because you mentioned that you lettered for 3 years for a company in India before, we came to know you as the ascendant superstar you are. But I thought one thing that was interesting about your story is that, near as I can tell, did you come into the medium of comics a little later on? Like, it seems like you may have dabbled in it a little bit, but you didn't really start diving into it until, I don't know, maybe your 20s, it seemed?
Yep. So I read comics as a kid. I mean, I kind of loved them throughout, but um, I mean, I live in India, right? So, availability of comics here is kind of random. So as a kid, I read a bunch of random issues of Superman and like some like issues of Spider-Man, and I kind of grew up on the cartoons, so like the Batman the animated series and Superman and that kind of stuff. But as I grew older, I kind of lost touch with superheroes. Like, even right now, I don't necessarily find superheroes a particularly interesting version of comics. Um, the reason I came back to comics was I think I was like 19 years old or something, and I was in the British Council Library around here, and I was reading Sight and Sound, like the British film magazine. And they had one of those articles which is like Biff Bam Pow, comics are not for kids anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And that's when I found out about Sin City, Watchmen, Uncle Sam. And I read these three comics and I was like, okay, I've been missing out. Like, if this is happening in comics, then I need to be here. And I think immediately I started thinking about comics as a medium to write in, because I was a prose writer before that. I used to work as a reviewer as well, so I used to write articles and reviews and things like that. Like, what would now be like a hot take writer kind of thing. Um, and I immediately found like, okay, there's a lot of potential in this medium. So I tried to work as a writer. So that was when I was around 22, 23. And it took me like 2 to 3 years to find artists who were willing to work with me for free, because I mean, at the time I didn't have any money. So like I couldn't afford to pay anybody. So I finally found an artist, like an artist who's still a friend of mine. Like, he stays very close by. And we made a bunch of comics for Indian magazines and things like that. And that's like actually how I got into comics first, like as a writer.
Hmm.
And like I started reading comics to enable that journey rather than like as a reader. I mean, obviously, like after that I picked up on reading comics quite a lot. But yeah, like it was always like oh, this is something interesting that we can do something in. Like it was never that primal thrill of like comics as a kid, like that you have as a kid.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah,
I mean, honestly, like I think that a lot of the creators I find to be the most interesting. I'm not saying it's like a universal thing, but I think sometimes when you come into comics a little bit later, you don't have so many preconceived notions about the medium. I'm not going to say you approach it differently necessarily, but maybe you aren't so resigned to the rules being like steadfast. Like this is the way you have
yeah,
to do it. And I mean, I feel like I can see that in your work to a certain degree, where it's like you're like, this is a way I could do it, but also what if I did it this way? And I'm not exclusively
yeah,
referring to hand lettering. I know you love hand lettering.
yeah. Absolutely, I think so, because even as a writer, the things that interested me were kind of the format. Like, okay, like you have this particular format, like of like 17 by 26 centimeters approximately. What if you half that? What if you like kind of work in strips? Like how are these things put together? Like, so I remember looking at 300 and like loving the fact that it's all done in double page spreads, even though I don't like the double page spread as a like a particularly as a reader myself.
Hmm.
I was suddenly like, okay, you know what? Like, there's this horizontal medium that does something. So yeah, I've always had this thing of, okay, how is the reading being mediated? Because I feel like, unlike film, like actually, I feel like comics is a far more artificial medium in the sense of the reader is doing so much work. So like it doesn't attempt to be immersive all the time. Like with prose or with movies and TV, the intention is to make the medium go away, and like the viewer can kind of immerse themselves in this. In comics, like you're so aware of the medium all the time, so I think you can push readability. I think you can push um, like in movies, do you know diegetic sounds and non-diegetic sounds?
Hmm.
Right, like in movies, like there are sounds that come from within the universe of the movie and sounds that come from outside. In comics, like it's all just sound. Like like it's so much like that. The layers are so much more permeable. Like I can pull you out of the story for a little bit and then put you back, and nothing is amiss.
Yeah.
Right, so I feel like it would be silly to not use those things. And in comics, like you can do that in very mainstream comics. Like a movie that does that or a book that does that would be considered experimental, while in comics, like you have like blockbuster comics doing like weird things with the medium.
Yeah.
So
Well, and I think the thing is too is like while some readers have a tendency of being they have like I said, preconceived notion of this is what a comic should be. Typically, the thing that's kind of cool about comics is if it's on the page, it's real. It's a thing. And so you can kind of play with that because like that's what you're talking about. It's like if you put it into like those mainstream blockbuster comics, it's going to work because readers know how to engage with it because comics are kind of always comics, even if it's
yeah,
like one comic. I mean, I read that one of the comics that inspired you to read comics was the City of Glass adaptation, which I just want to say, like
yeah,
starting with David Mazzucchelli is just like unfair to every other comic forever.
I know.
But I mean, you look at something like that, or like another Mazzucchelli like Asterios Polyp. It's like that's a completely different flavor than like something else you would come across or like something you would
Yeah.
do like Swamp Thing or something like that. But at the same time, like the language is still fundamentally mostly the same. So it's like it translates well. It's like a universal language, even though it's mostly in English.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there's a couple of examples here. Like, so take Mazzucchelli, take City of Glass. There's a point at which he, like the narrator sees the other Paul Auster with his family, and it's like an arrow to his heart. And the panel literally depicts an arrow to his heart. And then in the next panel, like you're back to normal. And there has been no indication. Like, there's no like you couldn't really like you could do that in a movie, but that would be a very flashy thing in a movie.
Right.
But in a comic, it's just there. Or like I was watching David Lynch's Dune the other day, and I remember people talking about how like the multiple internal narrations of the book translate so badly to the movie, and you can see that like where people are thinking out loud, like thinking in their heads, and it feels a little odd. But then you take something like in comics, even a superhero comic, you will have like Batman's narration and then Superman's narration and then somebody else's narration. Like I remember Identity Crisis having like multiple different characters narrating in the same issue, and it doesn't even like strike you as weird. It's like it's just you go with it.
It does strike you as weird if they don't indicate who the person is. That's the one thing that
True.
throws
Yeah.
you off. Yeah,
Absolutely.
but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
it's like if you fit within the accepted processes to a certain degree. I think that there's room for experimentation. But I do want to. I have to ask something. You mentioned the article about Biff Bam Pow. You letter the all nighter, right?
Yeah.
Did you do the newspaper where it says Biff Bam Pow? Like there's like an in-universe newspaper that talks about how superheroes are part of the universe now, and the newspaper is done by that. I didn't know if it was you or Jason Liu, but I just saw that and you
No,
said that,
I
and I
think
was
that
like,
was
is this
Jason.
the
Yeah.
moment where you bring this to life in comics?
Sadly, not. That is probably Jason. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Uh, Anyways, but it seemed like you got into writing comics. How did you end up on the lettering side? Was it initially about I know sometimes like I'll talk to a colorist who initially got into coloring because they wanted to do line art and they saw it as a foot in the door. Was it initially about opening doors or was it just something that fascinated you from the start?
Yeah. It was definitely not about opening doors because actually, and you could say sort of like, so here's what happened. Um, I lettered my first comic and I lettered it terribly. Like I used Myriad Pro and like, I mean, me and the artist, like we sat together and we kind of lettered this thing and like Myriad Pro 12 point, like whatever the default was, and like bizarre gray backgrounds for some reason. I can't even like, I mean, looking back, I don't even understand what the decision making was. But the point is, there was no decision making. Like we just thought we were putting text on the page. And then this writer called Tony Lee, like he's a British writer. He's done like Doctor Who and like a few other things. He came to Pune. Like Pune is the city where I live, and he tweeted out like, okay, do I know anybody here that can hang out? So we ended up hanging out for a couple of evenings, and I very timidly asked him like, can I show you this comic that I've made? And he was like, yeah, sure. And he walked like, it was like a 7 page comic. And he was like, okay, the writing's fine, the artwork's fine, but what's the deal with this lettering? Like, why have you done it like this? And I was like, okay, what are you talking about? Like, I don't understand. And he literally walked me through like all the decisions that I could have made to kind of, take the reader through the page, like, the font choices, what the balloons look like, how like placement would kind of affect the read and all of those things. And immediately I was like, wait, there's a whole thing here that I missed. Like,
Yeah.
this is a world. This is a world by itself. And that's when I got fascinated by lettering. And then around, I think 2 years later, I started practicing by myself. And, there used to be this forum called Digital Webbing. I mean, I think the forum's still around, but there used to be a letterers like water cooler kind of thing there. So you'd have people like Todd Klein, Tom Orzechowski, Nate Picos. I don't know if Workman was there, but like Kurt Hathaway, all these people hanging out together and with newbies. So we could kind of put up our pages and like get critiques from like literally the top people like in comics, right? And so like I kind of started learning lettering. And then I applied to this other Indian company, like not the company that I worked for 3 years, a different Indian company as a writer. Like I wanted to write for them. And they were like, we are completely full up on those, but do you do anything else? And I said, like, I can letter, but like, it's not really like, I don't know if I'm good enough to be a pro. And they were like, well, we won't know if you won't try, right? So let's give you a test. And I think they just hired me because they had nobody else who kind of even understood like even a little about lettering. I wasn't very good at the time, but that was my first job. And then I freelanced for around 2 years, and I would do all the things of. I realized immediately that I couldn't just do this in India. Like for this to be meaningful in any way, I had to break into the American industry. So I already followed a few artists and things, and I kind of tweeted at one of them, David Hahn, like for whom I lettered another book called All Nighter 5 years, no, 10 years ago. So I tweeted at him and like, I kind of privately messaged him later, okay, like, can I do this? Can I letter for you or something? And he gave me a bunch of lettering work at the beginning, and that kind of was how I got started.
Mm-hmm.
And then around 3 years, I know, wait, 2 years later, I decided to quit writing because I realized that I was not going to make any money writing in India because I mean it literally pays peanuts. I was getting more money for lettering like a single issue than I was for around like 2 or 3 weeks of writing.
Wow.
And that was when I realized that okay, you know what? I feel much more comfortable lettering for money than writing for money. So let me just focus on doing that. So that's how like the whole lettering started.
I'm trying to remember who started, was it digital, what was it, digital webbing you said? What was the, I'm trying to remember who started that site, because it was
I
a
think it
big
was Ed
letter.
Dukeshire, who's also a letterer. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it was Ed Dukeshire. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I remember that there's all these really interesting little like pockets of the internet that kind of inspired a lot of people. Like I remember I think there was a colorist one too. I'm trying to recall. But it is really fascinating how there's these little ones that pop up. But I did want to ask about you know, you're kind of getting in, you're figuring the job out on the job. Like you're kind of teaching yourself, it seemed. Did you find that
Yeah.
as you were kind of like teaching yourself the process, was there anything you had to like unlearn that you taught yourself? Or do you just kind of try to do things your own way because like you have your own approach and every letterer is an artist in their own right who kind of brings themselves to the project?
I have a few things that I did unlearn, like, but not things I'd learned exactly. It was stuff that I felt um, was right, and I think I had kind of screwed up priorities about what lettering does, which kind of got polished over time. So I still think that lettering is one of the most important things about how somebody reads the page. I mean, I will like if I'm like feeling like a little extra proud, I will just say like lettering above everything else. but like I remember I used to do this thing where let's say there are things in multiple planes. I would kind of put the balloons like in the middle, like so kind of it would bind the planes together. And that was something that now I completely disagree with. Like I used to do that because I thought that lettering doesn't need to kind of like you should have a lettering layer above the book, right? Which I feel like now is like kind of a boring way to do it. Like I think it's much more interesting if you are playing with the planes. So let's say there's somebody in the background and somebody in the foreground. I would try and not like intersect their balloons now, because like I want you to feel that they're in different planes. And that's pretty much like I so over time I've kind of tried to think of lettering as, okay, how would an artist approach this?
Mm-hmm.
Like like how can this become a part of the artwork, right? And I think that is why I had to unlearn a couple of things, but that's all. Like I don't think, I mean, I don't think I knew that much. I don't think I had too many conceived notions. Exactly.
One thing I really appreciate about your work is I feel like it would almost be difficult for you to have preconceived notions because it strikes me, and I could be completely wrong about this, that like every project you seemingly take on, you kind of come up with the right answer for that project. You're not just like, this is my DC answer, this is my ROM answer, this is this answer. You're like, okay, so I was going to bring this page up for like blue and green. Listeners can't see it, but there's this one page where it's like 3 columns of text where it's like in the midst of a piece of art, and it's interesting, and like the tick tock starts dropping, and like it gets askew and everything like that. And I feel like there are a lot of like I said earlier, there's accepted norms to the way things that should be lettered to a certain degree, and I think for a lot of letterers, doing what you did there might break those things. And
Yeah.
I don't know, I mean, it seems to me that, like I said, it's hard to have preconceived notions when it seems, at least as an outsider, that you just try to find the right answer to the project, not to the holy idea of lettering, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Like, okay, there's a couple of things to this. Firstly, that particular page is kind of actually designed by Ram.
Okay.
Like Ram had this idea that the text should be in 3 columns. And originally he wanted to fill up the entire page. But then so we sat down together, we opened up the page and we started laying out text. And like he could then see that, okay, you know what? I don't want that much text. I need a less amount of text. So originally it was supposed to go like in 6 columns, all like, 3 columns at the top, 3 columns at the bottom. Instead of that, we kind of took it to 3 columns. And then once I'd finished the like hand lettering draft, he actually saw that the word tick was kind of coming in like towards the end, like that single, like as a single word.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, oh, we could play with this, like we could kind of like mess around with the page and just kind of have that tick kind of go down the page as well, right? So that was down to collaboration. Like that was basically me throwing something onto the page, then him throwing something back at me.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that that's a very useful way to like break your own preconceived notions, because the other person will have an idea, the other person will have their own notions about what lettering can do. And I find that having collaborators who don't always know what is the done thing is actually very useful, because then they can ask you for weird stuff that, well, sometimes it might fail, but sometimes it will really work out. And then if it completely fails, I can tell them, like, you know what, I tried this, doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right. But then we tried, but then that might give me another idea. Right. Like there's another page in blue and green where there's a point at which a caption kind of goes over a man's eyes. And originally, what I had done was I kind of tilted it a little and put it over one of his eyes. And then Ram looked at that and said, like, why don't you tilt it the other way around and put it like over both of his eyes? So that's it's like, give and take. But also, I find that um, the key element here is time, I think, because if I have enough time, then I can do the done thing. I'll first do the boring version, and then I'll kind of delete that, and I'll give myself time to like kind of do something new. But if I don't have the time, then I'm kind of stuck doing the boring thing. Like then I'm stuck doing the normal thing. So I kind of, this is sort of an execution. Like, so I tend to keep my sound effects for the middle of the afternoon, because that's when I have the most amount of energy to kind of come up with new things. So I'll kind of do everything else around that time, and then I'll sit with the sound effects, and I'll go page by page and see like, okay, what can I do here? What would be interesting? And even there, like, I find it really helpful the fact that you're already reacting to something. Like somebody has already done something on the page. You're not doing it from scratch. So I can see how the artist is deviating from certain rules. I can see what rules they are breaking, and I can kind of like maybe break those. Or sometimes I need to be a counterbalance. Like sometimes if the artist has broken too many rules, if I feel like that, then maybe I need to be the glue to kind of bring it down to earth,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think the key factor there is collaboration. I think the key factor is if I have an idea, I can throw it to somebody else, and they can tell me if it's good or not. So I don't always have to think about whether what I'm doing is good, because there's somebody else to tell me, and I can do the same service for somebody else, right? So I think it's that. Like I don't think if I was doing it by myself, I would probably have a little more paralysis about trying new things.
Mm-hmm.
But because I'm working with like three other people on any given project, I can just try something. For example, when I started playing with color palettes, like originally I would kind of do very stark colors in the sound effects. And then at some point of time, I realized that the color palette was important. And then I started reacting to it. But because I didn't understand color, I was still reacting to it in very basic ways. And then the colors would tell me like, why don't you bump up the yellow there a little? Or why don't you kind of, it'll brighten it up a little, and it'll stand from the page a little better. So that was very important. Like there are other people here who know what they're doing, and then we can kind of make this together.
And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. Macroverse is a next-generation digital comics platform, and one with an astonishing number of comics, with currently over 50 series from over 100 creators on their app, with a 5-star rating both on Apple and Google's app stores. Download the app and binge all their titles, including the Eisner-nominated Remind from Jason Brubaker, Lisa K. Weber's Hex 11, which has been described as Harry Potter meets Blade Runner, or the new queer supernatural adventure series Husk that launches on November 1st. It's just $4.99 a month to subscribe to Macroverse, with proceeds directly supporting the creators on the platform. Keep an eye on the future of Macroverse 2, as 2022 is going to bring an epic upgrade that offers a new level of digital collectability and more, with early adopters able to sign up for more information at macroverse.com. And now, back to the show. I feel like you like sound effects. I don't. It seemed like you're dedicating your prime brain time to it. I think that's one of the interesting things, though. I'm going to get into a number of different things that I think kind of maybe define your work to a certain degree. But I mean, sound effects are always an interesting thing to me, because it's really hard for a reader to attribute who did it. Because like some artists are very particular about wanting to do it themselves because they want it to come from the same line. And other ones are just like, I don't have time. Like, please God, let her do this. How does your partnership with the artist affect things? Like, do you try to match their line in the font, like to work with them and, the sound effects in a way that complements them? Like, how does that affect what you do?
It's definitely, I would say for the first 3 or 4 years, that was like incredibly important to me. Like this is my goal. Like as an artistic goal, it is that if the artist looked at it, they shouldn't be able to tell whether they did the sound effect or I did it, right? And in that, like working with people like Sadra Beach or Bab Star was really important early on because they would do a lot of their sound effects, but not like 100% of them. So kind of trying to imitate their style and fill in the rest. That was just on a technical level that kind of made me get a lot better because uh, I'm not just like that is what got me interested in hand drawn sound effects in the first place because there were certain things that I just cannot imitate with a font.
Right.
Right. And then I realized that, wait, okay, I actually have a lot more control over the design of the panel if I draw the sound effect by hand rather than using a font for it. And that is how I kind of transitioned to like at this point, like 90% of my sound effects are drawn in Photoshop. And it's that where I like looking at the book 5 years from now, even the artist should not be able to tell which ones were theirs and which ones were mine, right? Or I should not be able to tell. And that's what kind of where it began. But that I started thinking a little more about the design of the page after that because that's why the artist is drawing their own sound effects, right? Like when sound effects were hand lettered, like by people like Gasper or John Costanza and all these people, what would happen is that the artist would draw the sound effect in rough in pencil, and then it would go to the letterer. They would draw the sound effects, and then it would go to the inker, right? So there was kind of a streamlined way of really integrating the sound effect into the artwork by default. Like nobody had to work for it. But now that that doesn't happen, we have to work for it. And I can absolutely understand an artist who looks at digitally lettered sound effects and thinks, okay, that's not how I would do it. Right. And so they decide to kind of letter their own sound effects. And as a letterer, that I like to take that as a challenge, right? Like I like to like I'm gonna try and do this better than you could.
Yeah.
And that that was sort of an early inspiration. Like, you know what, like I want the artist 4 issues in to start thinking that, you know what, I'm not going to do this anymore, let Aditya do this.
Yeah.
Like because he does it better than me. Now obviously, like because I use certain software and because I don't always have the time, that's not always possible to do, but that's something that definitely drives me. And you can also see that drives Haas because Haas is very dedicated to kind of, you know what, I will spend a lot of time on this, but I need to make this look organic. I need to make this look like it's part of the page.
Mm-hmm.
And for a while, it was almost a competition. Like we would kind of compare techniques and like we would kind of, okay, you're doing this, then I'm going to try doing that. But then obviously later, I mean, like there's a point at which you also want your identity to shine through. Like while I do not want to have a standard style or something like that, I would like the reader to identify that, okay, Aditya Bidikar had a part in this.
Right.
Right. So then I kind of figured out, okay, this is a technique that has a good balance of, okay, I can adjust to the artist's hand, I can adjust to the artist's line work, and I can have my own identity as well. So like that's kind of where I'm currently. But maybe in another 2 years I'll kind of try something new again because I get bored very quickly. So as you can see, because that's why I do all these different styles because I just get bored if I'm doing the same style over and over.
Well, you got to keep challenging yourself and you got to keep finding new ways to do things because otherwise you're just going to get like stuck in a single habit and it's not going to be interesting to you anymore. But this does remind me of it's something that's always stuck with me that I always found it really fascinating. I did an interview a long time ago back, God, like in the Zuda comics days. I don't even know if you know Zuda, but like DC like did this weird. I love Zuda, but anyways, I interviewed Phonographics, letterer of Saga, who also known as Stephen Finch, back when he went by Stephen Finch. Anyways, and he told me that it was generally the letterer's aim to go unnoticed, and I always thought that was an interesting note. Although I don't know if I necessarily agree with it because I feel like he's both right and wrong. I think what he's in my take is like some people are like, oh, like lettering should be like invisible. It shouldn't affect people. But I think what he really meant, not to like amateur psychology, Stephen Finch or phonographics, it's almost like you can bring yourself to it as a letterer, but you don't want to be incongruous to the point where it messes with the work. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think I get exactly where you're coming from, and I think I agree with that. Like I do have an opinion on this to the point where I wrote a rant about this in my newsletter, and I kind of compared different disciplines. So while I don't necessarily disagree with the idea that sometimes lettering should be invisible, I think that's the wrong way to look at it. Because there are times when you need transparency, and there are times when you need opacity.
Mm-hmm.
Like, uh, take somebody like Dave Gibbons versus somebody like Robert Valley or Daniel Warren Johnson, or like somebody who has a loud style, like their style is always in your face. You could kind of say that Dave Gibbons' art is invisible, in the sense of it is kind of you're looking through it to the story directly, and it is not creating a particularly deep screen for you,
Mm-hmm.
right? On the other hand, if you look at, let's say, Riley Rosmo's work, where the artwork is incredibly in your face, but it's amazing. Like there's a point to doing that. Like there's a reason to do that, and there are stories for which that's the right decision. Like if Promethea was done the same way as, like, Dave Gibbons' style, it would be a very different book, because Alan Moore is obviously reacting to J.H. Williams's artwork as he's reacting to Dave Gibbons' artwork. And so there are times I feel when, if I do a particularly loud lettering style that kind of is slightly incongruous to the art style, it would not be invisible. It would be very visible, and it would be wrong for me to have done that.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other books, um, like what's a good example? Like Motor Crush, for example. In Motor Crush, the lettering was always kind of in your face, like to the point where Tom Muller kind of lettered part of the book where his graphics kind of stood in for lettering as well, right? And there are books where that's the right thing to do, right? So if you feel like lettering should be invisible, then I would say then you should think the same thing about everything else. Like sometimes, even writing, like somebody using purple prose is not being invisible, right? And Stephen King would say that your words should be transparent, and like the story is the most important thing. But I'm sure somebody like Alan Moore would disagree with that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like their writing is incredible in your face. So I feel like people say that about lettering a lot for two reasons. One is that that's something that gets said about design as well, like in general, not just comic book design, but design in general is supposed to be invisible. And obviously, there are enough designers who prove that wrong as well. I think it's a way to not have to think about it.
Right.
Like, I think people say that so that they can say that, okay, here's my little permission to not think about the lettering, which is fine. Like, you don't have to think about the lettering, but I mean, you don't need a layer to that. You can just say, like, I mean, I personally don't think about the lettering too much. So while I'm not saying that it's a wrong thing, or like factually it it's wrong or something like that, I just don't like the framing,
Oh yeah.
because I feel like it would be a limiting framing. Like if I believe that, it's fine if the reader believes that. But if me as a letterer started believing that, my lettering would become very boring very quickly. So I can't believe that.
No, I mean, it seems to me, I mean, I don't think that phonographics meant it in like a self-diminishing sort of way, but I think if you went into it with that mindset that like you're meant to be invisible, it's just like, why even put thought into it? You're just like kind of filling a role at that point, and that's not really what you're there
Yeah,
to do. Here's a quick aside. It's like I was recently talking with a writer who was telling me about how he dictates the placement of the of the bubbles in the book, and I thought that was in the indication was that was fairly typical. And I don't every team works differently, but I do think that one thing that people forget when it comes to lettering is that there's so much about what you do that dictates pacing and environment and atmosphere, and it's storytelling. That's what it is fundamentally. And so any effort to make storytelling invisible strikes me as kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say a failure, but it seems like it may be a limiting factor.
I think that's a good way of putting it. Like, I think it would be useful to think of this as, there's a writing precept that you should know the rules before you break them. I think that kind of thing would apply here, like where maybe if you're learning to be a letterer, maybe first try learning to make your lettering invisible, and then you can try and play around a little more. And about placements, it's interesting. Like I will generally like there's a few companies that give you placements. Other than that, like nobody really gives you placements,
Mm-hmm.
right? So usually what will happen is that I'll do a pass, and then if I have questions about a certain panel, like some panels where I'm not entirely sure where the balloon should go, I will just throw it up to the team. Like I'll be like, does anybody have a good idea here? Or sometimes I will do something, and then the writer or the artist will come back and say that, could you move this here? And this is my reasoning. Like sometimes I've accidentally covered something up, or sometimes they feel like, you know what, like if you put it here, then the readers I would pass through these other things before coming there, and that's important to me. Right? Sometimes it's not important to me, but it's important to the artist or the writer, and I think that's very legitimate. And I think placements can be useful for a letterer because it's like, okay, somebody's had a go through the script and they've kind of given you one idea of how to do things. You don't have to do that, but okay, this is something that works. Now you're the expert. You can kind of take this and you can do something else with it, or you can just do what I did.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Um, if a writer started giving me placements, and then if I do anything different, they just come back and say like, you know what, that's not where I did it, and they don't say anything else about like justifying why they're saying that. I wouldn't like that.
Mm-mm.
Because I'm very happy to change anything I've done, as long as you know why you're telling me that, right? Sometimes I don't even have to agree. Like as long as you have a good reason for it, I don't necessarily have to agree to your reason. I'll just do it if you say so.
Yeah.
That's fine. But I want to know that you've thought about it. You can't just tell me that, hey, this is how I did it, and you didn't do it the same way, so you're wrong. Like that would not work.
Right.
I mean, yeah, like I mean, as a letterer, like I am definitely helping you tell your story. Like it is your story, and you do get to veto stuff. But come on, like I'm supposed to be the one who knows about this stuff, right? So
one thing I want to bring up is you mentioned time. Like time to me seems like one of the most important and defining factors of what you do, even if people don't really think of it, because so much of your work is about getting done by a certain deadline. It's like a determining factor, even if you don't want it to be. I mean, I'm sure that ranges on the projects. But one other thing that I think is interesting that maybe is a slightly different flavor of time is I imagine you enter projects at dramatically different times. Like something for like Blue and Green, you were on board from the jump. Like that is the way it is. No? Yes?
yeah,
Yeah.
yep, absolutely. I mean, we kind of like I was there when the book was. Sorry, I was there when they came up with the book. So
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you are, it's you and Raman Anand, and that's just the way it is. But for other projects, I'm sure you come on a lot later. And maybe that does that affect like when you enter a project, does that affect what you can do in a project as well?
definitely, but I wouldn't necessarily say that has to do with time. That has to do with the amount of decisions that have already been made. Like if I come in early enough that I can, then I mean, I'm again, like I'm a letterer who likes to be really involved with the process. Like I mean, I don't know my place. Like even like on corporate books, I'll occasionally ask them to send me a draft script or layouts or whatever, so that I can sort of, if I see the scope for something, I can tell them and they can maybe make that bigger. Like they can make that a bigger part of the storytelling. So I feel like if I come in after the artwork is done, then maybe there are ideas that I could have given the team that are now no longer available because the artwork is already done, right? Uh, but other than that, like time wise, if it's a book on which I'm not going to get enough time, I generally don't take it up. Uh, at this point, I can sort of I can make my own schedule. So if uh, if somebody came to me and said like it's Thursday, for example, and if somebody came to me and said like, okay, here's a new book and I need it by Monday, I'm like, no, thank you, please, like, you can go to somebody else at this point. But if they say like, hey, we have a couple of months, artwork is almost done, and then I'll just say to them like, okay, just send me whatever you have, like send me the script, send me the artwork, and till we come to the point where you need lettering, I'm just going to look at this. I'm just going to look at this and just going to think about it. And I'm going to have it at the back of my head. So, for example, right now, there's a series launching in April, and I'm already working on style options because I know that if I give them a style option early enough, then they can kind of adjust the later artwork to kind of certain decisions that I make right now. And I like that to be a part of thing, right?
Hmm.
Like I like like for example, it's as basic as, let's say a balloon style that I'm using doesn't have strokes, right? Let's say it's just white balloons. Then if I come in early enough, the colorist knows not to use pure white on any panels, because we might have lettering there and like we need something to stand out. Although obviously, like sometimes they will use pure white and then I'll change the balloon color a little to kind of make it more visible or something. So I think it's to quote Ram, it's a bit like a band, right? Like sometimes you're just bringing in a session drummer, and that's fine. That's okay. Sometimes session drummers make amazing albums, but sometimes you want the drummer to kind of come in early enough, and you design the song, around that, around the bass section, around the rhythm section. So it's like that, and I'm flexible. Like I don't think, like I wouldn't necessarily say that bringing me in early is always the better idea, because sometimes you don't need that. Sometimes it's better for you guys to focus on the writing and the artwork, and I'll come in later. But there are books on which, like for example, Blue and Green. I think the book would be done differently if in the early days I hadn't already started highlighting it and like showing them, okay, here's what this is going to look like, right? Even Graffiti's Wall, like we changed the lettering profoundly over time on the early, like first 8 to 10 pages, and I think that the book works differently because of it. Like the rest of the book was made differently because of it.
Yeah.
So
I do want to say I love your write up in Graffiti's Walls expanded edition about the process for coming up with and like you said, hand lettered look for the book. But I mean, this kind of, I think a constant theme of what we're talking about here is collaboration. I kept thinking of the musical element of Blue and Green as like, and I'm glad you brought up the band thing, because it really is like that. It's meant to be complementary, but you can also like stand out in your own right. And I do think that's one of the odd things. And I'm not saying this is a universal thought, but I think for some people, like lettering is like a production job. But I think in actuality, or when it's done right, it's a storytelling job. It's a equal or separate but equal part of the process, and not even necessarily separate. It's a complementary one. That's why I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about like working with like Ram and going back and forth, because ideally all these different elements of a comic lift each other up to make the best version of it. It's like the art by itself isn't necessarily great. The lettering by itself isn't necessarily great. The writing isn't by itself isn't necessarily great, but together they form the best version of themselves. And I think that's kind of what it gets down to, is like, no matter what project you're on, you work with the team to find the right answer for everyone.
definitely. And okay, I mean, have you seen the latest Dune? Like,
Yeah.
I'm kind of currently, I just finished reading the
Oddly,
book
I
as
haven't
well.
seen the Lynch
So
one.
it's interesting, but I wouldn't say it's a good movie. But I watched a featurette with Denis Villeneuve and his sound team about how they designed the sound for Dune. And there's like two long features. Like there's one 55-minute podcast, and there's like a 25-minute featurette. And I would recommend, like, if you're interested, please watch both. The thing is, that was one of the few movies that I know where the sound design actually affected the visuals back. Like they started designing the sound early enough that there are visual effects in the movie that have changed because of the sound.
Interesting.
Right? Like, for example, there are these shields, right? Like the blue and red shields. The entire rhythm of how the shields glow is based on the sound that the shields make.
Wow.
And that, if the sound design had come later, that's a decision that wouldn't have been made, because by then the visual effects are obviously very expensive, right? So you wouldn't have made that decision at all. So it's like that, where if I think of myself as sound design, um, there are obviously great movies that have sound design that comes in later, and that's fine. But if you have a direct, like, I mean, I would say like Ram is very comparable to Denis Villeneuve in that, because, for example, he has his like he has an opinion on everything, and that's a, like, for me, that's a great thing, because that's somebody who always is a bouncing board. But obviously you also have to have an ego to know that the other person, like you have to have enough of a like less of an ego to know that the other person knows what they're doing. So if somebody started micromanaging, that would be a big problem. But if somebody like Ram or like even James or Darcy, for example, these are people who definitely have opinions on everything that goes on the page, and then you can have a conversation. And for me, at this point, like there are people I work with the project sight unseen. Like I don't care what the project is, I'll work with you. Because for me, that collaboration, like see, I letter thousands of pages every year, right? If I'm constantly just getting the writing and the artwork and I'm lettering it and sending it back, that would be very boring.
Mm-hmm.
I love the fact that I work with different people and those collaborations are very different and I cherish certain collaborations. And for me, that is the most important thing. Like it's like again, like in a band, like the songs might be great, but if you don't enjoy jamming together, then like you're not gonna enjoy being a band for very long.
Yeah.
Right. Like I love the fact that I can sit and talk with people. I love the fact that we all love comics. So like I've literally had collaborations start because I like, we talked about lettering or we talked about something at a con, and then the writer reached out to me and said, like, you know what, like I've not seen your like this is very early on in my career. Like one person actually said to me, I have not seen what your lettering looks like, but I like the way you think about comics. So can you send me some samples and I'd like to work with you. And so the collaboration is the most important part. Like it's what makes these things work. Like you look at every collaboration, for example, Ram and Anand and I have done, each of them are very different, but it's the same three people making them. But because it's three people and we're kind of throwing different things in and kind of getting different things back, those three books that we have done so far look very different because they have different parts of us in them,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think I think if that's the difference between like if you want exactly your idea to be reflected on the page, then maybe you should write a novel.
Yeah.
Like if you're doing a comic, it's because you're going to be surprised back by you.
Yeah.
And I think that's vital.
It seems like it would be very unfulfilling to not be collaborative on it. And again, it's not to say that it can't be done or shouldn't ever be done, but it seems like, especially, I mean, unfulfilling for you. It seems like it's something that's really essential to your process. But do you mind if we rapid fire through a few different things? Because there's like some like dumb questions I have about lettering that, like, because
Okay.
I told you beforehand that you take on so many different projects and I'm fascinated by like the difference. So okay, you did A Map to the Sun with Sloan Leong. You did Blue and Green with Ram and Anand. Those are one was like a graphic novel. Well, they're both graphic novel, but one it's with a person you never worked with versus somebody or two people you've worked with a lot and you know really well. How different is that experience for you?
It's very different because, firstly, with Blue and Green, I was involved right from the beginning. Like I think even if I hadn't lettered that project, I would still be seeing pages from it because like Ram sends me pages of everything he does. Like because he just loves comics, right? Like so he'll be like, "Bidi, look at this page that this artist sent on a book that you have nothing to do with. Like just look at it. Like it's nice." He'll quote lines from his scripts to me because I mean that's his process and I love it. Like I mean, for me it's fantastic that I get to like have a conversation with such a smart person who makes comics. So we constantly talk, and the thing is, even between collaborations, we are kind of throwing ideas at each other. Like I will say that it would be interesting to do something this way. So, for example, with Blue and Green, I did say that my current focus at the time was trying to figure out a digital hand lettering process that kept all the quality of actual hand lettering on paper, but was like much easier to work with. And I was doing this independent of Blue and Green. I was doing this for myself, but I was just keeping Ram updated on it. And he's like, okay, let's try this on Blue and Green. Like, why not? Like, because, the hand lettering looked really good on Graffiti's wall. So, and Anand was working in a very different way on this. So I was like, I don't know if the same style will suit. So he's like, no, we'll do a different style. You figure out your digital hand lettering thing, and we'll try like multiple things on the pages, right? So that was very early on. On the other hand, with A Map to the Sun, I think the book was done when I came in. Like the script was done, the artwork was all done. And I think we played with around 6 to 7 pages to figure out a style that would work across like it's like 350 pages long, right? So we needed something that would kind of go over that time. So originally I sent her um, options with the balloons in white, like regular white balloons with black borders. And then I mentioned that, what, I don't know, that seems wrong. Like that looks wrong to me. So here's another option with colors in. Like I've colored the balloons and I've colored the balloon tails as well, like the font as well. See what you think about this. And I don't think I could have sent just one page there. Like I had to send like a sequence of 6 to 7 pages for Sloan and the team to kind of see that, oh, this looks interesting. We could kind of try to do this. Then I tried a different font for it originally, but then Sloan said that, okay, here's a font that I got made from my lettering. So could you try using that? And I tried it and it looked great. So I generated like italics and bolds from that. And we tried, like, that's the font that we use in the end. Right. So it was still collaborative. But I think once these decisions were made, it was just like I just went through the book and I lettered the whole thing. And yeah, I think I got a couple of notes about the dreamy sequences where like the lettering is on the page itself. I think she had a couple of notes about the placements and stuff like that. But other than that, it was mostly like text changes and things.
Mm-hmm.
While again, you go back to blue and green, Ram will have a lot of opinions about, like, okay, can we try this? Can we try that? Can you try and use a different font on this? Can you try something else on this? So like every few pages, we are kind of touching base. So because I don't want to do like 20, 30 pages, and then Ram has an idea that would be a good idea, but then I've done too much work to execute it.
Mm-hmm.
So like with blue and green, every 3 or 4 pages, Ram and I would sit with them and kind of figure things out. And the interesting thing with blue and green was that Ram was writing the script after the pages were drawn. So sometimes, yeah,
Wow.
I mean, so I think the first 20 pages were like standard, but after that they would just design the page together and like Ram would script it afterwards. So then sometimes before he was scripting it, I would give him an idea. Like I would tell him like, hey, you could try this in this. So then he would script it so that I could then execute that particular idea later. So it was much more collaborative. But I think, I mean, both. I'm really proud of the work in both books.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So Ram sends you pages from other projects. Do you quietly seethe on the other end when you get it and you're like, I should have lettered this? Why didn't he hire me?
I am incredibly jealous of those smoky caption boxes that Anwold and Darren did in Layla Star #3,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a story, like that entire issue told from the point of view of a cigarette.
Yeah.
Is something that I've known about for 5 years. And I was like, I would not have come up with those balloons, like those. I don't know if I would have come up with that.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that somebody did that, but I hate the fact that I didn't think of it.
So now you're gonna have to get Darren killed. Is the answer? He's too powerful.
Exactly.
He's too powerful.
He's too
There can only
talented.
be one. Okay. So another question in terms of difference. All right, I'm holding up Blue and Green, Radio Apocalypse #1. So you have those two books, same team, different format. Does that make any difference? Just from a timing standpoint, it seems like it should, because one is done when it's done, and then, or I mean, to a certain degree, I'm sure there's a deadline. Maybe not. I guess it was an image book, so probably no deadline. Yeah, but Radio Apocalypse, it's like you have the repetition. How does that change? How does that change things?
So firstly, I knew that I could not hand letter Radio Apocalypse because I'm going to have to take like around 2 to 3 days every month to do that book. And if I have a busy month, then the book is fucked. And I don't want to do that. So I knew it would have to be a font. I was hoping that it could be a font that I developed myself, but I didn't really have the time to do that. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is just stylistically, the book is much looser. Like it's much more, I don't know, like I know it's a very serious book. I know it's about like very serious things, but it feels to me like Ram and Anand are just having fun.
On Radio Apocalypse?
Yeah. So for me, that's the kind of groove I want to hit as well. Like I want to hit a slight, like Blue and Green might be hand lettered, but it's very precisely lettered. Like the lettering is like all the decision making is like, it's very precise, right? Even the lettering font, it's like, obviously I wanted the variation that hand lettering would give it, but it's a consistent font. Like it's a particular letter will always be hit a certain way. While in Radio Apocalypse, I feel much more like relaxed, and I can do like I can change the balloon shapes. I can play with those, and I can change the font once in a while, and it's all fine. Like I feel like it's much more. Yeah, it's I think that's the vibe I get from it.
Hmm.
So and like Ram and Anand have not complained. So yeah.
And now, a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. You may have heard of Bad Idea, the experimental comic book publisher that's rolling deep with titles from electric talents like Matt Kint, Mark Russell, Marguerite Sauvage, and more, and doing it with oversized, ad-free, over-the-top releases you can only find at select comic shops around the world. There's no variants, trades, or digital versions either, so if you want one of their big Final 5 releases that are being released throughout the rest of 2021, make sure to visit badideacorp.com to find a comic shop near you or to pre-order a copy online. Do so soon because rumors are saying Bad Idea is over, so this might be your last shot. And now, back to the show. So, one more comparison. You have Radio Apocalypse, an original series at Vault, and then you have Swamp Thing, also with ROM, but a for-hire project. How big is that difference? Is because I imagine DC has certain standards. Is there a huge difference there for you?
I think subconsciously, yes. Like I would like to say that they let me do anything, but the thing is, because I'm working for a company, I kind of go in with the idea that, okay, you know what, there are certain things that I might like to push, but because it's a company book, maybe they wouldn't let me push. So I think my styles for DC tend to be much more clean and much more like even when they're organic, they're much more legible. I try to think of a reader who reads superhero comics. Like there are certain things that I wouldn't do that. Like there's certain things which might take them out of the story, which I would possibly avoid. But other than that, the difference is just technical in the sense of for DC, like they send me the inks first, I letter them, and then I adjust the lettering over colors. While with an independent book, I can just say like, you guys just send me the colors, I'll letter afterwards. I have that much control over how the book is done, right? So I would say that's basically it. Other than that, like I think working with Ram and Mike, for example, Swamp Thing is a passion project. Like Swamp Thing is not a book that anybody does just to execute it, right? It's always been a book where people try and give their all and people try and give their best. So I think we approach something like that. Like we do some challenging stuff, some like formal play and all of those things. So in that way, it's actually very similar to the rest of the books.
Mm-hmm.
Like for example, Ram and I will sit like there's a layout in one of the Swamp Thing issues where uh, it's a spread and there are a lot of tiny panels and the lettering kind of goes all over the spread. And that was something where Ram was like, I have not written this. You tell me how many words I can fit on this double page spread, and then we'll sit together and we'll write the spread. So that's how we did it. Like he wrote it much later and we sat on the like I was literally like pasting his words from Facebook into Photoshop into Illustrator and I was kind of moving them around and I'm like, okay, how does this look? How does that look? So I mean that's very similar to our independent books. So there's not that much of a difference.
I love it. I love it. I mean, Swamp Thing is kind of an unusual for hire book, anyways, because it has always kind of come across as a passion project in a way that's something else. Like, not to diminish like the all nighter, but I imagine that has a considerably different feel to it than like something like Swamp Thing. Where Swamp Thing, I don't know, even Mike feels very inspired by it. He feels like very included in a way that his work normally isn't, where he normally does great work, but this time it feels like he's kind of getting pushed in a different way. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy overrating how Swamp Thing is, but it seems
well,
like
I'm
an
very
unusual
proud of the
beast.
book and what we're doing on it. So
What's that?
I said I'm very proud of the book and what we're doing on it. So
Yeah.
I definitely love what Mike's doing in it. I think some of the layouts, some of the figure work, even like it's just very interesting stuff. And I think also it's like okay, I think it matters. It always I think every artist is reacting to the script either subconsciously or consciously. So I think if you get a script that is just 100% your jam, you're gonna push yourself doing it. Like
Yeah.
you're gonna like it's gonna be a little different. Like even as a letterer, I feel that like when I get a script that is just like, oh, this is a banger, I'm gonna do my best to like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna make sure that my support is like, I don't want to let this script down, right? So like, I'm gonna put in my 100%. But with Chip, for example, it is an independent book, right? Like we are kind of making it and giving it to
Yeah.
Comixology. Like Comixology, um, I mean, I don't get any direct Comixology edits. We do have an editor who probably gets those from Comixology, but it always feels to me like they're just cool with us doing our thing, and like, okay, let the team do their thing, and then like, okay, you can send us the book, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's very like a lot of independent companies work that way. Like the editor is there to help you out rather than to kind of dictate anything that's happening in the book.
How frequently do you think, oh, this is a banger when you get a script?
These days, quite a lot.
Okay.
I work. I think as I've kind of made my way through the ranks, um, I mean, there was a. It's always special when you get a script from somebody like that you did not expect, and it's fantastic. Like, I mean, the first time I worked with Ram, like I had already started working with American comics, and Ram was a name that I knew only through Indian comics, and I hadn't read anything by him, and he sends me the script and the artwork, and I'm like, I don't know any other Indian writer who works like this. Like this is different. This is very interesting. So when he asked me on his second comic, I said yes immediately, and then that comic surprised me again.
Mm-hmm.
So I do love the idea of like, for example, Darcy Van Polgeest. Now I talked to him a few times on Twitter, but I didn't really like. He wasn't a comic book writer before that, right? Like he's a film director. And then I read the first issue of Little Bird, and I was like, the hell is this? So you can see me leveling up in Little Bird as well. Like, I think Little Bird and Daffodil's Wall are two places where you can see me leveling up. Like, this is a different book. Like, this is, I can't just do what I've been doing so far. Like, this has to be something different. And I have to push myself.
Mm-hmm.
So, Little Bird has a font that I developed myself, and it has like sound effects, like kind of breaking through the panels. It has like really big, loud things where I'm like, okay, you know what? Like Ian Bertram's going 100%, actually 150%. And if I do this at 100, then I'm kind of letting him down.
Mm-hmm.
So I need to do this at 150.
I feel like Ian was inventing new percentages for that book.
Absolutely. There's a couple of sequences in the book where I was like, I know I'm supposed to letter this, but I can't stop just staring at it. Same with Isola. Like I mean, obviously I was already a fan of Carl's, but the kind of things that he and Michelle did together and Sassy K did together are just, oh man, this is so beautiful. I can't let this down.
Carl is, I mean, I have Abominable Charles Christopher art up here. Like I have a print up there from one of, I'm a massive fan of Carl's. You do really interesting things in that, because do you do like the kind of like tick, tick, tick marks and stuff like that? Or is that Carl?
That was started by Carl. I think he did that on the sound effects because he had this idea that I wanted the sound to be felt rather than read.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the idea, so I just started doing that as well. Like, so there's a bunch of places. I mean, that's a book where I don't think at this point I could tell which ones were done by Carl and which ones were done by me. The English ones were obviously all done by me, but on the other languages, so in issue 3, we kind of sat together and created another script for like these people, and that script then later gets used in other things. So, like, you know, it was kind of a back and forth there. I was definitely inspired by Carl's sound effects in how I did that script, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very animistic, like it's very connected to nature. So,
Yeah.
like when I was creating that script, I also wanted it to be connected to nature. Like Brendan and Carl can't, by the way, read that script. Like I'm the only one who knows what that script means.
I sort of want to do an Instagram live with you where I just hold up your work and you have to decide, was it you or was it the artist that did something? And just like, I don't even know how we would prove whether or not you're right or wrong, but this seems like a very fascinating game show.
I can pull up the files. I have like all the files that I've ever done in a folder on a hard disk.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I hope it's backed up. I'm sure you have lots of lots of backups. Okay, to close, I'm very fascinated about like the way that people work sometimes. It's like you talk to an artist and there's different phases. There's like layouts, and that's when they really have to think because that's the storytelling. The pencils, where it's like, really got to put down the page. And then like inking. Like inking always comes across as like the Zen moment for a lot of artists, where it's just like, this is just, it's relaxing. You can kind of listen to whatever, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I actually used to do inking in 2019 for like around 3 or 4 months because it was so relaxing.
Yeah.
I was just like, okay, this day has been very hard. So I'm just going to print out like pencils of some artists and I'm just going to ink it.
Yeah, yeah. I am interested in whether or not it feels like there's phases to lettering as well. Like, is there a moment where you kind of get in the zone? Like, what's the mindset like through the process?
Okay, so the first step is basically it's very mindless. Like you're copy pasting the script onto the page. And like, I mean, these days I have an assistant that I kind of send most of this stuff to, and they copy paste it and send it back. And then I sit and I think that's actually another reason that I like to do the sound effects together, because for me, this part, like the balloon part, is kind of the mindless phase. So I'll put on a podcast or I'll put on a sitcom or something like that, and I'll just start executing it and just go through it. Like just go through the whole page. I'll get into like this flow kind of state, just finish the book. Then I come back and I start making decisions, right? Like, so now I will see like, okay, you know what? This tale doesn't work. I need to make this more interesting. I need to kind of like have this like be a burst, like a bigger burst or something like that. And that's when I start like, okay, I can't listen to anything. I need to be focusing. The sound effects are where I'm legitimately making visual decisions, right? Like, I mean, I am making visual decisions throughout, but like most of it is kind of subconscious and intuitive at this point. All I need is at the end, I need to have a very conscious look through the whole book, right? So, I mean, I'm not sure I'm explaining myself very
No, it
well.
totally makes sense. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of similar to the phases for the artist too, where it's just like sometimes you like when it's like extremely visual or you're making these big decisions, you got to focus because it's problem solving. Other times it's executing what you had already come up with.
Exactly. Like in lettering, around I would say half of the decisions are purely placement decisions, right? Like it's just deciding where the balloon's going to go. What the balloon is going to look like is already decided, so you're just executing that. Then there are the specific balloons where, oh, somebody's tired, somebody's shouting. Those you have to kind of put a little more of your mind into. And sound effects are like very visually driven. Like you need to sit down, you need to try and see what the artist is doing, and you need to make that decision. And after everything is done, I give myself an editorial phase where I just look through my decisions and see if anything needs to be upgraded. Kind of like, okay, this is a 90, I need to take it up to 100, like all of those things. I kind of go through. I like to have, when I had much fewer books and a much smaller monitor, I used to actually put the book onto my iPad and I used to kind of read through it and I make circles, kind of literally edit myself. But now I have a pretty huge monitor behind this thing. So like the page is already visible at like slightly bigger than print size. So I can just look at that and I can just kind of make the decision there. Yeah.
Do you have a comically large, like curved monitor, or is it like you're in a supervillain or something? No. Okay.
I wish I could, but the thing is, I don't think that would be very good for visual work. It's actually it's much more cool than it is useful.
Yeah.
I have a photography grade monitor where I can see the colors more accurately because that's what matters more to me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense.
It's a pretty big one though. It's 29 inches or something.
Oh, that's the dream. I am nowhere near that. My one, it keeps like fritzing out because my cats decided to suplex it one day when I was up sleeping. I came down and I was just like, what happened down here? Every once in a while it decides that it doesn't want to use proper colors anymore, which would probably be bad for anyone who works in comics. But I want to close with, so you mentioned earlier that you were writing. It just didn't it didn't make as much sense financially because it's like you had to do a ton of work and you made far less than you did on lettering. You originally, from what I understand, were interested in being a prose writer, and it became tough to like balance writing for yourself versus writing for money. And that's always a difficult balance. It's like trying to find something that works for you, but also for like your ability to make a living. My read on it as an outsider is like you've kind of you got your Jim Campbell Excel doc that's helped you solve a lot of the time problems you have and everything like that. It seems like you kind of figured things out a bit. Do you think you'd ever like to get back to writing in a more substantial way? Or do you think that, I don't know, like that phase is kind of past you?
Can I go on for a little long on this? Like, because I
Yeah,
have
go
like
ahead.
quite a few thoughts have been coalescing over time. So, so when I quit writing, that was actually kind of heartbreaking for me because I had been writing since I was 10, I think. And that's all I ever wanted to do. Like, I wanted to be a writer for a living. Except what happened was the moment I started like telling people this, like my family or like my friends, everybody brought in the concept of money. Like, okay, if you want to be a writer, you got to make money. So I think I got split between what I wanted to write and what I thought people would like.
Yeah.
And by the time I was an adult, I think I was way too focused on what people would like than what I wanted to actually express. And and I think frankly, technically speaking, I wasn't as good as I could be at the time. Like I mean, I've read stories back from that time, and conceptually they are fine, but a lot of the execution, like a lot of the character work, leaves a lot to be desired. So when I quit, it was like legitimately heartbreaking. It was like the most difficult decision I'd ever made in my life. Okay. And I never regretted it because I think I thought it was the right decision. So the thing is, I never stopped writing after that. But that was giving myself permission to stop writing for money. Full stop. Now you only write for yourself. You don't have to publish. You just figure out what you want to write. And I spent something like 6 or 7 years doing that. I did have a few stories published in that time. Like I think I've gotten better and better. And I'm actually going to have a story published next month. And I recently had a comic published in Razor Blades #4, which Roche, like the colorist on a lot of my comics, he drew that. He drew and colored that. So it's a 5-page short comic. So I've been writing prose stories throughout. I've been writing like 11,000 word like novelettes and things like that. But I used this last 6 or 7 years to kind of figure out what I want to be as a writer. Like, who am I as a writer? Because once you take the question of money out of the equation, you suddenly realize that, like, I mean, I suddenly realized that a lot of the things that I thought I wanted to write were just stuff I like to read. Like, I don't necessarily want to be writing this. Like, I just thought I wanted to write it because it sells, right? So now I've reached a point where I've like I have a I have around 3 stories in submission right now, like to different magazines and stuff. I had one story published last year. I have another story coming up soon, and I think I'm comfortable at that because I like lettering for money, as in like this is my job. Writing is what I do for myself, and if a part of that can be shared, like I've written like something like 15 or 20 stories over the last 6 or 7 years that nobody's ever going to see because those were just for myself to figure out like, oh, do I like writing this? Do I like writing this kind of stuff? Then all these discussions I've had with Ram and Dan Waters and Denise Camp about what are stories, like why, what is the story for, or like what do you think about the world, what is your worldview that you want to express to other people. you know After having all these discussions, I've come to a point where I think I'd like to do like maybe one series a year, like comic book series, and a bunch of short stories, maybe like 4 or 5 short stories a year or something like that. And that's the pace that I feel I can write at. But it's not important if I don't make that,
Hmm.
like make that happen. What is important is that every story I write is something I believe in. I don't even care if they make money.
Yeah.
Like it's fine because I don't need that money. Like I have a job. So writing is at this point how I want to express the things that I feel about the world. And I think I'm really enjoying it. Like, so I wrote this Doctor Who story that's going to come up in a charity anthology next month, which I didn't get paid for because it's a charity anthology. But like I got to write a riff on these African tall tale kind of mythology things in a Doctor Who context, which was really fun to do. Like I just really enjoyed doing that. So for me, writing at this point is just about, okay, I had a good time writing this, and that's sort of what matters. Now, um, once I start making comics, obviously, like the artist would come into the equation. I would be paying an artist, and making the book profitable would be uh, well, part of the equation. I wouldn't say it would be the most important thing, but it would be like nice if something sold. So at that time, I'm gonna be a lot more strict about what books did I try to get produced, because I understand that if I do something absolutely esoteric that 100 people will read, that's not maybe the best choice for the artist. But I can still like I can still go ahead and write that and then just not produce it. It's fine. Like I just wrote 5 scripts that nobody's ever gonna see. It's fine. All good. So that's where I am right now. It might change in the next few years.
It seems like you got to a point where you could write for yourself rather than for anyone else, and I think that's a pretty healthy place to be.
Yeah, I think that's what I needed, and I needed to figure out what I think about stories, because um, I used to think that the idea is the most important thing, and then I realized that wait, I'm not the best when it comes to like coming up with original and weird ideas. So if I'm not the best at that, then what am I trying to do? Then characters, like I was like, oh, I'm not the best at doing that. So then what am I trying to do? Like all these questions, and you know, I am surrounded by some of the best writers in the medium, and I would be an idiot if I didn't take the opportunity to learn from them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've learned a lot over the last 3 or 4 years, and I hope to put it into practice soon.
Well, thankfully your banger rate is super high because then you learn a lot from all those scripts. I mean, it'd be hard not to learn just because like you're so immersed in it. You're so like that's and because the collaborative nature is such an important part of it of everything you do. It's like you've been collaborating as a storyteller for a long time, even if you haven't been writing them yourself. I mean, even if you haven't been writing them yourself in a public way, I guess.
Yeah. No, and I think my attitude to comics has changed a lot. Like when I came in as a writer, I I thought in words, and then the images kind of came later. Right? Like the images were important, but the most important thing was the story and the words that I was writing. But recently when I've tried to write comic scripts, I found myself thinking in images. Like I have a page design in mind now. Like I have certain panels that I want, kind of, oh, this would be interesting, and that's the key to the story. Like certain images are key to the story, and that's something that I don't think I could have gotten to if I hadn't been lettering like thousands and thousands of really well drawn pages.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you start thinking in images. Like even the lettering, obviously, like it has to do with words, but it's a visual job, right? Like I am playing with the visual here. Like I am you've painted a painting, and I am another painter coming and putting a brushstroke on your painting, right? So I need to be very careful about, like, I need to try and understand what you were trying to do. So I think I've developed a much stronger relationship with the image in the last like 6 or 7 years, and I think that's completely profoundly affected my writing. So for me now, like what needs to be a comic and what needs to be a prose story is much more clear. Like it's much more differentiated. Like it's not like, okay, one could be the other.
That's one thing I think is really interesting about lettering, and I'll leave you with this one. But I mean, I think it's really interesting that, in a lot of ways, I don't know, and I don't know how many people really think about it this way, and maybe they don't think about it because what I'm about to say is stupid. But it's like I think lettering is kind of the intersection point from where art and writing kind of meets. It's a very visual thing. It adds to the visuals. It is the visual manifestation of the writing element, and it is kind of like the tie that binds in a lot of ways between the two of it, because for a lot of readers it guides your eye throughout the entire page, and it kind of dictates how you engage with everything. And it is kind of like the point where, like I said, where writing and art meets in a very real way.
No, visual manifestation of the words is an excellent way to put it. Like that's it, right?
Yeah.
Right. Like, and you actually see it in practice. Like when I'm first developing a style, the artist is incredibly involved, because for them the style is what is going to intersect with the way they've drawn it. So like, whether I'm matching their line, whether I'm like the font style matches their artwork or not, all of these things are incredibly important to them at the beginning. And after that, I'm just generally dealing with the writer. But that's because my visual approach has been decided. And and obviously the artist would come in later if I mess something up visually, right? Like, so, like, I am what you're saying is correct. Like I am taking the words from the writer and I am figuring out how the artist would want that space placed, and kind of trying to manage both things. So it's funny. Like I was never a visual thinker before I started lettering. For me, at the time, lettering was just a way to get my words on the page. I was one of those readers who literally just read the words, and the artwork was just a way to keep track of what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm just profoundly the opposite. Like for me now, the comic is a primarily visual experience, and obviously the words matter a lot. But if the artwork sucks, I am not reading your comic.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just not. Yeah. So like I read through. I mean, there are a couple of famously badly drawn comic book runs that I'm not going to mention out of courtesy. That the first time I read them, I didn't even realize they were badly drawn because I was just looking at the artwork to keep track of what's happening. That's all. Like the words were the more important thing, and I just couldn't do that now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've taken on. I mean, we went from having too much work to probably an appropriate amount of work. And I'm guessing during that time you learned a whole lot. But I mean, I'm so happy to see you thriving. I'm so happy to see your work doing so well. But Aditya, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about lettering, your career, everything you do. I appreciate you taking the time.
This was a lot of fun, man. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with letterer Aditya Bidikar. You can find him on Twitter at Aditya B, and his work in so many comics. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site, Sketched at sketch.com, for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content and its members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking on Facebook at /Sketched, following on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Nicholas Palmieri, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Van de Ven, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Brian, Submit Industries, Raj Patel, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Scott Buwan, Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Brad Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillos, Patrick Barrow, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Salates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Nassie, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.